In this module, we will discuss the Charter of WTO. After the Second World War, the United States and its allies in Western Europe thought of adopting the measures of liberal trade as the international trade was passing through a phase of extensive trade barriers. A proposal to create International Trade Organization (ITO) was floated at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Employment at Havana in 1948 to have safe and sound policy of reduction in tariffs and barriers to international trade. This charter to create ITO was adopted by 53 countries at UN conference. Simultaneously, some of the countries were also trying to negotiate multilateral treaty to ease their trade and tariff restrictions at Geneva in 1947. When the ITO Charter was not ratified by the United States Senate due to its enforcement provisions that would have adverse effect on the autonomy of its domestic policy making, these countries moved ahead in adopting an interim arrangement of multilateral trade policy that also had the clauses of commercial policy of Havana Charter until the ITO Charter was ratified. This multilateral trade treaty was known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) that was signed on October 30, 1947 and came to existence from January 1, 1948. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) was established as an international organization headquartered at Geneva, Switzerland to regulate international trade and tariffs adhered to its widely accepted specific rules and regulations to promote free trade through multilateral trade negotiations among member countries. There were 128 member countries that were signatories to GATT. At the end of the year 1994 and almost covered over 90% of world trade at that time. The member countries known as GATT contracting parties used to meet annually for making provisions for tariff and non-tariff barriers through consultations to resolve trade disputes and to permit retaliatory action thereupon. The barriers obstructing the free flow of trade was gradually lowered through successive rounds of negotiations. In a nutshell, it can be said that GATT became a forum of trade negotiations and dispute settlement among contracting nations. GATT rested on three fundamental principles. First, non-discrimination and reciprocity. This principle emphasized acceptance of most favored nation clause by which any bilateral trade negotiation between two contracting parties had to be extended to all other contracting parties on the principles of non-discrimination and reciprocity basis. Second, elimination of non-tariff trade barriers. This principle refers to prohibition of all non-tariff barriers such as quotas on trade except for protecting domestic industry. Third, settlement of dispute. It is based on the consultation among contracting parties in settlement of any trade dispute within GATT framework. Initially, the disputed parties negotiate between them and if not resolved, the matter was forwarded to an unbiased panel of experts from contracting nations having no interest in the matter. If the offending party didn't comply with the recommendations of the panel, the aggrieved party was allowed to retaliate by cancelling some or all concession offered to the offending party. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the Charter of WTO, learn about the World Trade Organization, its contents, functions and basic principles, understand the structure of WTO. Let us now discuss about the GATT rounds. The first round of negotiation was held at Geneva in April 1947, whereby 23 contracting parties negotiated tariff concession on product by product basis known as request offer approach. The outcome of this bilateral negotiation round was the removal of certain duties and preferences on certain items, reduction of standard rate of duty preferences, fixation of standard rate of duty-free treatment and fixation of duties at existing preference on certain items agreed between the contracting parties on request offer basis. The second round of negotiation took place at Annecy, France in 1949, aimed at facilitating joining of 10 more countries which had not participated in first round of negotiations held at Geneva in 1947, increased the number to 33 contracting parties. In this round, tariff reduction was primarily discussed and around 5,000 tariff concessions were offered. The third round of GATT was held at Torquay, England in 1951, where 38 member countries participated to discuss tariff negotiation among member nations. 8,700 tariff concessions were agreed upon, reducing the tariff to 3/4 of tariffs existed in 1948. During this round, the United States declared that International Trade Organization (ITO) Charter will not be ratified by United States Congress and will not be resubmitted. It signified that GATT became the only organization to deal with multilateral trade among member nations. The fourth round of GATT was held during 1955 to 1956 at Geneva to tariff negotiations, but was reserved by the fact that the President of United States was authorized to reduce tariff only to the extent of 15% of the duties or 50% ad valorem as per the Trade Agreements Extension Act of 1955. It created dissatisfaction among the contracting parties as the inability of United States to reduce greater tariffs that refuted the combination of most favored nations and reciprocity principles of GATT. It implied that other contracting parties could not be in a position to offer higher reductions of tariffs. The fifth round of GATT, also called Dillon Round, occurred once more in Geneva during 1960-61. At Geneva again with the initiative of the United States to renegotiate the customs tariffs. With negotiations covering 14% of world trade, the rates of custom tariff amounting to 2.4% were not remarkable. The aim of the round was to discuss the economic effect of the creation of European Economic Community on the expansion of international trade. The United States was concerned in holding discussion because of the external customs tariff to be put common to EEC as a whole. The least developed countries also expressed their reluctance to follow principle of reciprocity to extend concession as the developed countries avoided to negotiate on tariff concession on the products which were of vital interest to them. The sixth round of GATT, also called Kennedy Round in Geneva during 1962 to 1967, was a remarkable step where the developed countries realized the growing trade needs of LDCs. The aim of the round was not based on the product-to-product negotiation, rather introducing multilateral negotiations of linear nature covering whole commodity groups. In 1962, the President J.F. Kennedy submitted a draft trade act known as Trade Expansion Act, where he was conferred with the negotiation power to reduce customs tariff by 50% and abolish duties on industrial goods if the United States export to EEC increases. The objective of the round could not be achieved as the EEC failed to agree on the 50% reduction of duties on foodstuffs and finally were excluded from the round. The result of the round depicted that non-tariff barriers could not be dismantled and the tariff reduction was made to the extent of 35% by the developed countries like USA, EEC, Japan and Canada. The 7th round of GATT, known as the Tokyo Round, was held in Tokyo during 1973 to 1979, where 99 countries participated in the negotiations covering tariff and non-tariff issues. The round deliberated upon the areas including dumping and anti-dumping duties, tariff reduction, subsidies and countervailing measures, government procurements, customs valuation, simplified import licensing procedures, removal of technical barriers to trade. Though the round was a significant step to extend the scope of GATT regulation to non-tariff barriers, it was designed to fulfill the requirements of developed countries as the developing countries were not much benefited. The 8th comprehensive round of GATT, known as Uruguay Round, started in 1986 and concluded in 1994 in Marrakesh, Morocco. It was the first step towards the multilateral trade negotiations where 123 countries participated. The emphasis was on creating a new organization where the mandate of the round was to include those areas of trade that were previously exempted, not included as difficult to liberalize, like agriculture, textile, trade and services, intellectual property rights, investment policy. Hence, for further liberalize international trade with a fundamental shift from the negotiation approach to institutional framework, a new organization called World Trade Organization (WTO) was established in 1995 by replacing the GATT completely. However, the GATT and WTO coexisted in the year 1994 during transition period. We shall now understand the World Trade Organization (WTO). The World Trade Organization for regulating international trade is the only permanent international organization that began its life on January 1, 1995 under the Marrakesh Declaration during the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations. Its headquarters is based in Geneva, Switzerland. It is concerned with making global rules for international trade between member nations and resolving their trade problems. The WTO agreements are negotiated and signed by the world's trading nations and ratified in their parliaments. It provides several conciliation mechanisms where the member governments participate and try to sort out their trade conflicts amicably through negotiations. These negotiations bind the member nations for their commitments for conducting international trade. The conflicts that cannot be resolved through negotiations are adjudicated under the WTO Dispute Settlement Court. The system ensures equal treatment for all the participating members and encourages their member nations to fulfill their commitments. The membership of the WTO has reached to 161 countries on April 26, 2015. The agreements establishing the World Trade Organization include: first, multilateral agreements on trade in goods. Annexure 1A covers GATT 1994, agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, textiles and clothing, technical barriers to trade, trade-related investment measures, TRIMs, anti-dumping, customs valuation, pre-shipment inspection, rules of origin, import licensing, subsidies and countervailing measures and safeguards. Second, General Agreement on Trade in Services GATS, Annexure 1B. Third, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS. Annexure 1C covers copyrights and related rights, trademarks, geographical indications, industrial designs, patents, layout designs, protection of undisclosed information, and control of anti-competitive practices in contractual licensing. Fourth, understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes. Annexure 2. Fifth, trade policy review mechanism, Annexure 3. Sixth, plurilateral trade agreements, Annexure 4 covers agreement on trade in civil aircraft. 4A, agreement on government protection. 4B, international dairy agreement. 4C, and international bovine meat agreement. 4D. Next are the functions of the WTO. First, administering trade agreements. The WTO shall provide the system for smooth implementation, administration and operation, and further the objectives of multilateral trade agreement, and shall also provide the framework for implementation, administration and operation of the multilateral trade agreements. Second, acting as a forum for trade negotiation. The WTO shall act as a forum for negotiations among its members in case of any conflict between the nations concerning their multilateral trade relations. Third, settling trade disputes. The WTO seeks to resolve trade disputes among its members through dispute settlement body. The dispute settlement body shall have the authority to establish panels, maintain surveillance of implementation of rulings and recommendations under the covered agreements. Fourth, reviewing national trade policies. It enables the regular evaluation of trade policies and practices of individual members for the enforcement of specific obligations and contributes to improve adherence, disciplines, commitments made under the agreements. The function of review mechanism is to examine the impact of trade policies of member countries on the multilateral trading system. Fifth, cooperating with other international organizations. The WTO shall promote cooperation as appropriate with the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development (IBRD) and its affiliates to attain greater consistency in global economic policy making. Next, basic principles of the trading system under WTO. The fundamental principles of the trading system under WTO are the foundations of the multilateral trading system. These principles are: first, trade without discrimination. Under the WTO agreements, countries should not discriminate between its trading partners. This principle is termed as Most Favored Nation Treatment (MFN). According to Most Favored Nation clause, a member country is bound to grant an equal treatment to the products of other member country not less favorable than accorded to the products of any other country. Moreover, the promising member country should not discriminate between its own product and imported foreign products, services or nationals. It requires that such national treatment necessitates the treatment not less favorable than the equivalent domestically manufactured goods for the goods entering in the market. In other words, no special trading advantages, low tariff or high import quotas should be given to any member or to discriminate against it by the promising country, stipulating all should be treated on equal basis. However, it has been specified that the Most Favored Nation clause should be relaxed to cater the needs of the developing countries custom unions and free trade areas so as to enable them to get benefit from the best trading practices wherever and whenever negotiated. Second, freer trade through negotiation. Removal or reduction of unnecessary trade barriers is one of the most prominent features of the WTO to encourage international trade. The WTO agreements allow member countries to incorporate changes gradually through progressive liberalization. Furthermore, the developing countries are permitted longer period to accomplish their obligations. The barriers that restrict international trade include customs duties or tariffs, import bans or quotas to restrict quantities selectively, red tape and exchange rate policies. Initially, emphasis was on lowering tariff, but by the 1980s, such negotiations were expanded to non-tariff barriers on goods, services and intellectual property. Third, predictability through binding and transparency. Under the WTO agreements, the member countries bind their commitment at the agreement of opening up their market for goods. To increase the amount of trade under binding commitment was one of the motives of the Uruguay round of WTO. Binding refers to ceilings on customs tariff level for a particular product that is committed by a member country and cannot be increased without compensating for loss of trade through negotiation with its main dealing countries. The WTO attempts to ensure the conditions of trade and investments to be more predictable and stable by making it extremely difficult for the member countries to amend the rules of the trade commitments at their whims and fancies. The other ways to improve predictability and stability is to reduce the use of quotas, eliminating quantitative restrictions, and making the system transparent as possible. Many WTO agreements insist the governments of member countries to display their policies at domestic and international level. Fourth, promoting fair competition. The notion between non-discrimination (MFN) and national treatment discussed above is to ensure fair condition of trade at global level. Since the issues are quite complex, the rules framed try to examine what is fair or unfair and in what manner the governments of member countries should react, in particular by imposing additional import duties calculated to compensate the loss of trade caused by unfair practice. The WTO supports the fair competition in the global market. For example, the agreements on government procurement specify the competition rules to purchases by the several governments in several countries. Hence, it is a structure of rules committed to open, fair and undistorted competition. Fifth, encouraging development and economic reforms. Since developing countries require flexibility in time to implement the system in their respective countries, the WTO agreements help in ensuring the provisions of granting special assistance and concessions for developing countries that were also inherited in the previous provisions of GATT to contribute towards the development of trade among member nations. During the Uruguay round, 60 countries adopted the trade liberalization programs autonomously. Most of the countries were prepared at that time to meet the obligations that were required of developed countries. Moreover, the agreement also provided the transition period to adjust themselves to the unfamiliar change, particularly for the poorest, least developed countries. At the end of the Uruguay round, it was adopted that the developed countries should speedily implement their market access commitments on the goods exported by the least developed countries. It is also found that many developed countries have started to allow duty-free and quota-free imports of almost all products from least developed nations. It depicted that the WTO believes in economic reforms for the development of trade among their member nations. Sixth, protecting the environment. The agreements of WTO encourage its members to adopt appropriate measures to protect not only the environment but also public health, animal health and plant health. The policies of protecting the environment should be implemented on equity basis to both national and global businesses. In other words, no member country should employ environmental protection measures to act as a means of disguising protectionist policy. Now moving on to the structure of the WTO. The WTO is headed by the Ministerial Conference composed of representatives of all the members, which shall meet at least once in every 2 years. The Ministerial Conference shall carry out the necessary steps in carrying out the functions of WTO. It has been vested with the authority to take decisions on all the matters pertaining to any of the multilateral trade agreements if so requested by a member in accordance with the specific requirements. There shall be a General Council comprising representatives of all the members, which shall meet as and when required. It carries out the assigned functions of the Ministerial Conference to it during the intervals between the meetings of the Ministerial Conference. General Council shall also convene as and when required to discharge the responsibility of the dispute settlement body as per the dispute settlement understanding. The dispute settlement body may appoint its own chairman and lay down the rules of procedures as required necessary for carrying out those responsibilities. The General Council shall convene as required to discharge the responsibilities of the Trade Policy Review Body. It may have its own chairman and establish such rules of procedures as required necessary to carry out its responsibilities. 3 councils such as the Council for Trade in Goods, a Council for Trade in Services, and a Council for Trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights works under the general guidance of the General Council. These councils perform their tasks assigned to them by the respective agreements and by the General Council. These councils shall have the right to make their own rules subject to the approval of the General Council. The Ministerial Conference shall form a Committee on Trade and Development, a Committee on Regional Trade Agreements, a Committee on Balance of Payment Restrictions, and a Committee on Budget. I repeat, on Budget, Finance and Administration, which shall carry out the work assigned to them. These committees shall also perform additional tasks assigned by the General Council if required. These council may make such additional committees with such functions it may deem fit to do so. The Committee on Trade and Development shall meet periodically to review the provisions in multilateral trade agreements specifically earmarked to least developed country members to report to the General Council. Furthermore, the plurilateral trade agreements shall be carried out by the assigned bodies under the agreement and report to the General Council on regular basis about their activities carried out. Let us now recapitulate what we studied so far. A proposal to create International Trade Organization was floated at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Employment at Havana in 1948 to have safe and sound policy of reduction in tariffs and barriers to international trade. This charter to create ITO was adopted by 53 countries at UN conference. Simultaneously, some of the countries were also trying to negotiate multilateral treaty to ease their trade and tariff restrictions at Geneva in 1947. World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization for regulating international trade is the only permanent international organization that began its life on January 1, 1995 under the Marrakesh Declaration during the Uruguay round of GATT negotiations. Its headquarters is based in Geneva, Switzerland. It is concerned with making global rules for international trade between member nations and resolving their trade problems. The GATT rounds. The first round of negotiations was held at Geneva in April 1947, whereby 23 contracting parties negotiated tariff concession on product by product basis known as request offer approach. The outcome of this bilateral negotiation round was the removal of certain duties and preferences on certain items, reduction of standard rate of duty preferences, fixation of standard rate of duty-free treatment, and fixation of duties at existing preference on certain items agreed between the contracting parties on request offer basis. Structure of the WTO. The WTO is headed by the Ministerial Conference composed of representatives of all the members, which shall meet at least once in every 2 years. The Ministerial Conference shall carry out the necessary steps in carrying out the functions of WTO. It has been vested with the authority to take decisions on all the matters pertaining to any of the multilateral trade agreements if so requested by a member in accordance with the specific requirements. Thank you.